Fantastic. Excellent. Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event tonight with Mei Li Chai celebrating her collection tomorrow in Shanghai. I'm Car, the events coordinator for Green Apple Books here in San Francisco. And tonight we were going to be joined by C. Pam Zhang, but unfortunately she's sick and no longer able to join us. So we are sending her all of our good wishes for a speedy recovery. Good well wishes to you, Pam. But we are lucky enough to have the wonderful Hannah Dela Cruz Abrams here to join Mei Li Chai in conversation. We're very glad to have her and her dog Griffin as well joining us this evening. A little bit of brief business before we get started. I would encourage you to check out our full event calendar on our website at greenapplebooks.com. I'll link to that in the chat. If you enjoy events such as the one you're attending right now, you might enjoy other things that we have coming up. And I will say too, please do consider purchasing a copy of Tomorrow in Shanghai from Green Apple. All of our events are free unless stated otherwise. And so we always appreciate it if you are able to purchase a book for the event that you are attending. But we do understand that folks aren't able to do that every time. But if you are able to, we always appreciate it. Before we get started, I just wanted to let you know the kind of format that we're looking forward to tonight. We're going to have a conversation between Mei Li and Hannah. We're going to hear a little bit from the book, and then we're going to follow that up with an audience Q&A at the end. I would encourage you to enter your questions into the Q&A at any point during the hour, whenever they come to you, so you don't lose them, and we'll get to as many as we can by the end of our time together. So without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce the two authors that are joining us this evening. First, Hannah Dela Cruz Abrams receives the 2013 Whiting Writers Award for her novella, The Man Who Danced with Dolls, and her memoir in progress, The Following Sea. She's been further supported by the Ronna Jaffe National Literary Award and a North Carolina Arts Council Fellowship. Her work has appeared in Orion, the Oxford American, Story Quarterly, The Pinch, Southern Humanities Review, and elsewhere. Abrams currently teaches in the Department of English at the University of North Carolina at Wilmington. Let's give a hand for Hannah Dela Cruz Abrams. And last but most certainly not least, Mei Li Chai is the author of the American Book Award-winning story collection, Useful Phrases for Immigrants, and 10 other books. Her prize-winning short prose has been published widely, including in the New England Review, Missouri Review, 17, The Rumpus, Ziziva, Dallas Morning News, and the San Francisco Chronicle. The recipient of an NEA Fellowship in Prose, Chai is an associate professor in the creative writing department at San Francisco State University, go Gators. And her collection, Tomorrow in Shanghai, I'll show you once again because it's quite beautiful, is the reason that we are here this evening. Please join me in welcoming Mei Li Chai.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Car. Thank you for Green Apple for hosting our event. Thank you, Hannah, for being a pinch hitter after Pam was ill. It's just such a blessing that Hannah was able to step in today.
It's my pleasure. I'm really happy to be here, honored to be here, and excited to talk to you about all sorts of things. Where would you like to start? Is there anything in particular that you have had on your mind?
Well, something I thought we could both talk about, since we represent multiple diasporas, and you represent the PI and AAPI. We've been dealing with a lot of things during the pandemic, just in addition to just the fear of COVID, and just trying to stay alive and working. There's also been a lot of, anti-Asian hate incidents. And interesting, a lot of like weird resentment about even those conversations. And so I wanted to say that, even though none of the stories in this collection are set in this present moment, I felt like all of the stories, those set in even in the 20th century or decades earlier, or even the one that's set 100 years in the future, I'm trying to reference this kind of moment, the xenophobia, the terror, the paranoia, some of the media propaganda. And I want to show that it's not just now, right? This wasn't just Trump. He was terrible, but these types of currents are always present. And I know you've been dealing with some of these things too in your own, like you teach widely, you teach, online seminars as a renowned essayist and writer in your own right. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad that you wanted to start here because, I'm thinking of all the writers who've said that writing is a political act, and it feels like that's true always, and particularly in this moment. And in the exchanges that I've had with aspiring writers and readers, there has been a lot of resistance. There's also been a struggle. I'm here in North Carolina in the Deep South, but I don't know that it's not exclusive, obviously, to where I am geographically, and these questions come from all over the country. But yeah, some of it is hard to absorb and surprising to hear. Uh, Not long ago, we were talking in one session about cultural appropriation and what that meant. We were reading Indigenous work, and there was a member of the group who felt that we're really hyping up something that doesn't need to be hyped, that this is not something that is the job of writers, and also that if a culture exists and it's visible, that it is not appropriation. The words were, "It belongs to me. It belongs to me if I can see it." And
And
if
this
I
was,
like,
can you say who, like, define who this writer was? It was not a native writer. It's not an
not a
indigenous.
native writer. This is, and this is in the same comment, this writer identified as white, male, Christian, and said, actually, even though he was not in California at the time, that he had spent a year there and had felt, and I thought that I wouldn't hear this phrase again, but he felt the victim of reverse racism. And so there's a lot to unpack in that. It's not the first time I hear this, more than people might think. So what are your thoughts? Like, what do
I
how
mean, I blessedly don't have to hear that too much, where I'm currently at. Um, like, we're more like, even in our creative writing program, we're very diverse, and we have students of very, very different backgrounds. And I feel people are generally respectful of each other and our communities. So like that kind of blatant statement is more rare. But as you know, like where I grew up in South Dakota, people would just, neighbors shot at our house. They killed our dogs. They left them on the lawn, for us to find when I was a kid. That was inspired in part by this sense that, some people belong, and people like me and my family, we somehow don't belong. I was told, in school, that because my family had moved there, we didn't belong there. And one of my classmates had said, we belong here because we grow here like the crops. And I remember thinking, just ironically, but you're white and you're not really from South Dakota either, right? I mean, you clearly this is a very, very large double-digit percentage of my classmates in my public school were Indigenous, were Lakota, or members of the Six Nations tribes of Indigenous to South Dakota. And so I found it ironic that somebody could just blatantly say that and think that when there was still visible presence of the Indigenous people. So we're in an interesting moment. We're in an interesting moment of, I feel like, as the pandemic progresses, people are still going to be looking for scapegoats. And I feel like it's really important for all of us to band together and to remember that those who do very well in pandemics, making money, profiteering, the billionaires who have made a tremendous amount of money off of our suffering, and have pushed to open the economy very quickly, and kind of like are not voting for like free vaccines anymore, and trying to cut that spending, would love for us to be at each other's throats, right?
Right.
So
Yeah, absolutely. I was reminded as you were speaking, I was thinking of the aggression that can sometimes come out in comments like that and resistance like that. And I was reminded of Joan Didion saying that sometimes it felt like writing is a hostile act, hostile in the sense that you are going in often to try to wrench someone from their point of view, and you're trying to shift it in a very literal way. And so I'm wondering, like, how these ideas inform your craft. Like, how conscious are you of the reader when you write?
I think I'm conscious of the reader when I edit. I feel like I think it's really hard to be conscious of anyone outside of myself when writing, because it's just such a different process. It takes a different part of the brain. And I feel that in the writing process, one needs to just be free to be a mess on the page, to draw from, whatever inspiration, and to get it out there. And then in the editing, I have to think, does this make sense to anyone but me? What is the journey of the reader through this story? And then I have to think about, is the perspective of like the protagonist clear? Or are the stakes clear for the protagonist? I have a lot of different kinds of protagonists in my collection. And like I have like the story collection starts off with um, a so-called convicted criminal, right? A man has been convicted of a crime and he's been sentenced to death. And we start off with his point of view, and then it shifts to the point of view of a surgeon who's been hired to extract his organs. And these were, I was trying to think of what can I put in contrast of each other, right? And
Mhm.
we like people we tend to admire in society, and people, of course, a convicted criminal is always like the person we would think of as someone who deserves or getting what they're deserving. This is what the media tells us, what we're meant to see them as. And I wanted to kind of poke holes in that master narrative and to
Mhm.
think about, well, what would create empathy? Like why did this person commit the so-called crime that he committed? And he was a blood merchant, a Shweto, who went through the villages of his province and bought blood. He had a mobile plasma spinning unit, as people did back in China in the 80s and 90s, and even, pretty 90s when the government decided to stop this, but it was perfectly legal. It was perfectly legal, and it ended up inadvertently spreading HIV throughout the countryside in China. And then the way the government responded to this once they discovered about the HIV spreading was to convict the blood sellers and then execute them. And so that was a kind of justice, right? It's a kind of official justice, but it doesn't go into the issue of, well, why were people hired to do this, right? Why were there mobile units going through villages and selling it to city hospitals? And part of it is a lack of a donor culture. Didn't have the networks for that, and also part of it is that as China moved from entirely planned economy under the early days of Chinese socialism/communism, and they opened to the market economy, this is a way hospitals made money, right? So I feel like, again, we're always talking about the crimes, the larger crimes of capitalism, and the larger crimes of, like, not everyone has equitable access to education. So a lot of the people who were doing this, they had no idea they were spreading HIV. And if you think about it, the people who should have known that this was going to happen, um, you know, like, how can you sterilize your equipment in a village that doesn't have regular access to even electricity?
Yeah.
Um, and those questions were not posed because it was a way to, get a product that had a price.
Yeah, that point of view shift in the title story is absolutely masterful and such a great reminder of the kind of fluidity that we can flex on the page. And I love that story and I love what you did in it. And it's just seamless and surprising, though, at the same time. And another like benefit to having these stories is that I'm thinking of Chimamanda Adichie said that the danger of a single story is that you just get one story. You don't get the whole story. You don't get all the stories. And so I think it's vital that we're getting your stories on the page. And when I taught your work last semester in the very first AAPI class that's been offered at my university, a refrain that I was hearing was, I'd never heard of this before. Why had I not heard of this before? Why aren't we teaching this? And so, yeah, it just comes home to me hearing you talk and reading these pieces that without them, the story is not complete. And so you're helping to fill out the narrative in a way that's really critical and beautiful as well.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah. I was going to say, like, one of the things, like, I have a lot of geographic diversity in the stories. Like, I have stories set in China. I have stories set in various parts of the United States, from California to like the New York City, New Jersey area, tri-state area, also the Midwest. I've got stories set in Indiana, and then I have stories set in France and even on Mars. And it was really important, as you say, like, to think about the diversity of the point of view. I didn't want it to be seen as I didn't want it to be used as a stereotype or stereotyping people. I wanted to try to think of how experiences differ depending on when you are in a place and where you are, as opposed to like, oh, all Chinese people behave in one way. Um, and then I also think about like timing. One of the stories, as you know, takes place in rural Colorado, and it's called Life on Mars, even though it doesn't take place on Mars, and it's about a parachute kid. And that was inspired by, in part, by all the parachute kids I have met in my real life. And parachute kids, for people who don't know what that is, it's like teenagers who were sent by their parents in another country to live in the United States, go to school here, with the hope that they will eventually be able to sponsor their families. So they parachute them in on their own. And my father was a parachute kid. When he was 17, he was sent by his family all by himself to the United States. He didn't have any relatives here. He didn't know anybody. And it was 1950, and he was sent to upstate New York to go to school. He had a scholarship there, and it was a very fraught time. There was still, just the exclusion era had ostensibly just ended. Chinese had gained the right to become naturalized citizens in 1943, so only 7 years earlier. And it was still, there were not very many Chinese where he was. He was the first Chinese student at his university. And then he was also put to work, like he comes on a scholarship. He was at one point, he was working as a houseboy for like one of the trustees of the university. And, he's like, oh, he's a nice Chinese boy. He can be the babysitter for the kids. And like, he's never done anything like that. He could have been a serial killer for all they knew. Right. But they just assume Asian man, he would be good at doing this. And he would use, when I was growing up, he would tell us these stories of like, once he was taking the kids for a walk, and it's like very rural out there, and a bull came charging at them, and and so he had to figure out how to save the kids. Another time, like he was told to take them to a swimming pool, and so the kids jumped in, and he was so alarmed he jumped in after them. But then my dad doesn't know how to swim, so then he had to so the kids ended up having to save him, but he didn't realize it would be so difficult to swim until he was actually in the water. And then when I lived in North Carolina, in Wilmington, your town, there was actually a young woman my father and I met in a restaurant near the university. And I guess because there's still in present not that many Chinese people in Wilmington, North Carolina. So she came up to my dad and me, and she was telling us her whole life. And she was saying like, oh, how, like her parents had sent her to North Carolina, and this is, she was going to high school at a local public high school. When she graduated, she was hoping that she could get to New York. And then when she got to New York, she was going to try to find a sponsor for her family. And I think about like just how much time has passed, how much is different, how much is similar. And so that's when I came up with the idea for this parachute kid. And like he's sent by him lonesome to the United States, as people are. And things are just not at all what his parents expected, and not what he expected. And you just have to find a way to survive.
Yeah, and you can feel the alienation in that story and the distance between the growing distance between himself and where he's come from and his parents, and that he's fumbling for a way to express himself by discussing space exploration becomes really poignant. And it's thrilling too to hear some of the inspiration that you've managed to braid into these pieces in a way I would never suspect that some of these details may have come from your father's life, but you inhabit them so beautifully and so wholly on the page. Like, I'm so close to him, like the psychic distance is very minimal. When you were talking about what changes and what stays the same, and of the Chinese Exclusion Act, I was thinking of Vincent Chin, who many of us know and a lot more people don't know about. And the fact, for those of maybe everybody here knows, but just in case, Vincent Chin was someone who was a Chinese American who was living in Detroit in the 70s and was beaten to death by men who believed he was Japanese, and therefore responsible for like the demise of the auto industry. But what strikes me, many things strike me about his story, but one of the details that I always remember is those two men did not serve Evans, right? Rob Evans and his stepson did not serve a day in prison.
Not
And
serve
they,
a night in prison. I think they were
not a night, not
not a night.
anything, not a moment.
They
Yeah.
served, I think they might have been
Did
brought
they?
in. They might have served some like when they were first brought in or something, but they didn't spend a night. They did not have to stay overnight.
And the conviction was overturned eventually when it was when they took it to the Supreme Court, I think.
Didn't go to,
Um,
I don't think I went to Supreme Court. It had multiple forms, and like originally there was a jury that was multicultural in Detroit. And I
mhm.
think they were found guilty, and then on appeal, it was overturned.
That's right. There was a
Because
30-year sentence at one point that was obviously never served, right?
yeah, and then
Yeah.
they were moved to like um, a more suburban white jury who, sided with them over Vincent Chin, who was definitely seen as the alien and as the threat.
These are
So,
not the kind of men that we send to prison, was what one of the
judge,
judges,
yeah.
said. And the fine of $3,000, you go back a few decades and there was a fine of $3 for killing someone. And so I think about how little do you think that Vincent Chin is possible in today's society?
Um, I, I mean, well, yeah. I mean, in terms
I
of
mean,
like someone being scapegoated and murdered, yes, we see that all the time, unfortunately, and across different communities. We've had cases like that here in San Francisco during the pandemic, in which a lot of older senior Asian Americans have been, and Asian, even not necessarily Americans, even just Asians who happen to be in San Francisco, have been attacked. And, several have been murdered, and in New York City as well. These are the ones that the media gets attention of. So we don't even know what's going on, in other parts where there's not as much media attention. And Community Voices, one of the stories, the last story, the nanny, is inspired in part by some of these attacks. Here in San Francisco, there was a Toys R Us woman who, an older woman who was attacked on Market Street here in San Francisco early on in the pandemic. Some 30-something-year-old man went up and just punched her, and she was so shocked, but she actually had the wherewithal and was physically strong enough that she picked up just some board that was lying on the street on Market Street and just smacked him back and fought back. And what's interesting is when the paramedics came, they first took the man, and they couldn't understand what she was saying. She was just crying on the side of the road, and they could see him bleeding because she had smacked him, really hard. But they left her on the side of the road until someone could translate, could speak Toisan dialect, and could translate and explain, what she was saying, that she was calling out in distress, and that witnesses came forward and said, no, actually, that man attacked her, which is horrifying, right? So it's like, there's so much violence, and there are so many narratives that don't necessarily make it into the media. And so I
Right.
kind of, that last story is addressing that, but it's set on Mars because it was just too painful. I couldn't set it in the present. I really kind of wanted to set it in San Francisco. That was gonna be my San Francisco story, set in the present, about a nanny, and then dealing with this kind of, hardworking woman, Chinese immigrant, dealing with all this. And I just couldn't bear to write about it in the present because it was just too painful.
Yeah.
So setting it farther away into the future, because as you say, is this still possible now? Yeah, of course it's still possible now, and we know that in the future it's still going to be possible as well.
Right. I think that's an important addition, that we know it's enduring. So yeah,
That's why we speak up,
that's
right? That's why
that's
we
right.
speak up. I know that's why you speak up in your activism and your writing and in your teaching. And it's also why, I write and teach, and
Yeah.
it's like, we have to protect ourselves, our communities, and speak up against these waves of violence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think remembering that that this is a constant that we have to always pay attention to and sort of beat back that current always. Maybe it's a good time to go to a little bit of a reading from the book, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I'll read from that last story I just mentioned. Um, it's point of view of a nanny, works a working class older Chinese woman, because I feel like that's also another point of view. Like, we don't really see necessarily older working class Chinese characters centered in this way.
Mhm.
Um, there's been a lot of attention, like I'd say in the past decade, on kind of rising China, China, wealthy Chinese, and there's nothing, that's part of it. That's part of the experience. So certainly, such people exist. But for this story, I wanted to write about a working class character. So I'll read a little bit about the nanny's perceptions. The next couple weeks had passed without incident when An Ping woke one night to a sound so strange she wondered what hungry ghost had strayed on the wind and crept into the bedroom. Her mother used to tell her such stories when they slept huddled together in the winter, lying under a pile of quilts on the Kong, their earthen bed with the hollow space beneath for warm coals. Hungry ghosts are lost spirits. Their families have forgotten them. No one burns paper money at their graves. No one puts rice and sweets out for them to eat. No one bows before stone tablets bearing their names. Only weeds grow on their unswept graves. They have lost their way between the world and the next, and thus they travel on the wind. That's the sound of their crying. The rain is their tears, her mother had told her. When I die, you mustn't forget me, An Ping. No matter where you are, you must never forget me because my family won't remember me. My own mother is dead, and my father didn't want another girl. I'm a stranger in this village, and no one here keeps the old ways anymore. But when you're an old woman, when I'm as old as you, Mama, older even than me, don't forget me, An Ping, and I'll watch over you. Promise me, An Ping. And her mother cried, tears sliding down her cheeks as they huddled close together, the storm raging outdoors. Nanping wondered what it would be like to be an old woman, older than her mother. She couldn't imagine such a thing when she was a girl, with her father on the far side of the Kong, snoring, too tired from working in the fields all day to tell stories at night, and the whole world was comprised of the dark space she and her mother inhabited beneath the quilts, her mother's soft voice whispering in her ear. Um, I just wanted to talk a little bit about like kind of that also, that it seems like a folk tale, the idea of hungry ghosts and being forgotten. And it seems maybe long ago and far away, but this is my own grandparents' beliefs. You know what I mean? I mean, my grandfather was very worried as he, was in his 70s, and he would tell my father, don't forget me when I'm gone. You must, he wanted us to have the altar for him and the picture of him and not and have fresh food. He said, it's very important to have the fresh food. So you change it every day. He did not, even though he technically had, converted from Buddhism to Christianity, these old beliefs were very, very important to him. And so I'm thinking about in the future, some beliefs may travel, and even if people don't believe in the rituals literally, I feel like the rituals connect us to that sense of our past. And I feel like even if my grandfather didn't believe literally that, he'd have a hungry ghost that needed to be fed and then needed to have that fruit there for him to eat, he still, didn't want to be forgotten. And this was the ritual that gave him meaning and gave him like a sense of that he had mattered to the family. Um,
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's true in my family as well. And I think that's there are other powers in rituals besides the literal, and that's communicated so beautifully in that piece. Do you know where your stories are going? Some people say that when they write the first sentence, when they get that down finally, the whole story is unspooling from that, and they sort of know its end, like where it's going to run out from the start. Do you? I don't feel that way.
No, no, I don't. I feel like I have like I have an idea for a character in my head,
Mhm.
and I think I want to see what happens to them. Like I knew with Life on Mars, which is about the parachute kid, I knew I wanted to have a teenager. I knew I was going to put him in like a very different setting. I wasn't really sure where the setting would be, and that so it took me a long time even before I started writing because there was this big incident with parachute kids in the LA Times a few years ago. Maybe it's more than 10 years ago now. But there was a group of rich parachute kids who formed their own gang. They were all by themselves and they actually started committing crimes and they ended up turning on each other and like they were doing just really horrible, vicious, violent things to each other. Like one girl was like burned with cigarettes. And finally, I don't know how the authorities got a hold of them and the gang was broken up and then several of them were sentenced to like prison. And one of the boys I remember was interviewed in the Times and he said, it's actually going to prison was for him the best thing that ever happened to him because he had actually found like at least people were paying attention to him as opposed to the feeling that he was completely alone in the world, which is really eerie to think about. And that's not to say that I think that prison is a positive experience for people and that this, but that was just a quote that he had. And I thought about that. So I wanted a parachute kid and I was thinking about where to set him, what time period to set him. And originally I was going to have the tremendous, I was going to do like something like he's going to be this evil kid and do these bad things. And then I thought, I can't want to write that story. I don't even know how to write from that point of view. Like, I mean, even if he does bad things, it doesn't mean he's evil. So I just felt like I couldn't write like that kind of crime story. So it's like the writing process is to think about what obstacles could I put in front of him. And again, like I kind of thought that when I started, maybe I'll kill him. It's terrible. Like it feels terrible to say that. When you're writing, you can think of dramatic things that you would not wish on real humans. And I thought, well, maybe I'll kill him. And and I did not. I know it's not a spoiler, it doesn't give anything away to say I didn't kill him off because that's a terrible idea. It's like the lowest hanging fruit of drama, right? On a story to say, oh, I'll kill off the character. Instead, I gave him a lot of obstacles just to test him
Mhm.
each time to see and to surprise myself with what kind of like path that he could think to survive. That sounds
That's-
horrible and mean, doesn't it?
No, it's fascinating. And also, I'm always reminding my students to think about the author's choices, but this story was so true to me, true feeling on the page that it never would have entered my mind that that was an option, that that was even a choice that you had contemplated at any point. I love that character in that piece so much, and his his loneliness and his hope are so they resonate so deeply. Um, yeah, there was a question that I had a while back that was just about like I know this is a little bit of a pat question that comes up in interviews, but I'm genuinely curious because I don't know, even though you and I are friends, if I know this, what are the writers, who are the writers that influenced you? Like, what do you think shaped you as you were coming up yourself?
In general, or like, I mean, it's so hard. I mean, it's like, I think every writer shapes us, right? So I think that's why we have to
Right.
be very careful about what we read. I feel like when I was much younger and I was just first in school, I felt like very dutiful as a student. And I felt like I almost didn't have the right to object. And like, in the 80s and 90s, we read some real horrible crap.
Mhm.
The curriculum was not, I don't, it's not like crap. It's not that it's not well written, but it's just like, it's not nourishing. It's not nourishing, right? As women, the women of color in many ways, it's just not nourishing. We read a whole lot of short stories and fiction from the point of view of very privileged white men. And and the sentences were certainly polished, and like the plot points, like if they started here, it would feel very polished by the end, and it would make sense, and it wouldn't be random. Um, but oh my God, the exclusion, and also they tend to be very misogynistic in the point of view, and I just like I think it was very um, it was so off-putting that I didn't even envision myself as a creative writer. So I started off my career in writing as a journalist, and I had many journalism internships in when I was in college, and then I graduated and I worked for the Associated Press, And, I thought, one, it's pragmatic. Back in those days, you really could get paid jobs as journalists. Now it feels less pragmatic. Journalism is so under siege. But I felt like, but since I didn't see any representation at all, I don't think I was ever assigned a book by an Asian American author the entire time, like K through 12, all the way through the end of my undergraduate college days. And I
Yeah.
think I just, same, yeah. And you're younger than I, and I think I just found things by accident. Like, I found a Han Su-yin book at a used bookstore in Minneapolis once, and I found like Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior on a table at a bookstore. Like, it wasn't assigned to me, and so I never saw myself in the space. So I never imagined. It didn't occur to me that I could do it, or that anyone would be interested. And so I went into journalism because I thought, well, I will tell story. This is be a way to tell stories about the community, and to make sure we had some representation. And so I did it. It was actually really good training. And I was extremely shy when I was younger. And so it would force me, because otherwise I would have nothing to pay my rent, or no money to buy food. It would force me to go out there and talk to people and interview people and be very aggressive with that. And so I, like some of my first stories, like I covered the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square massacre, and I'd been studied in China, so I called China, the AP, and I got into these interviews with students who were trying to evacuate. And then I also, at one point I was living in Des Moines, Iowa for the AP, and I would interview, I remember there were in the 80s, God, America put, like, the resettlement plan for a lot of Southeast Asian refugees coming into the country was to put them in Iowa, right? And it's like there were like 7,000 Southeast Asian refugee families who were relocated to Iowa, which is like not a great place. It's for this type of culture and refugee background, because it's climatically so different, right? And there just wasn't any networks in place to preserve culture. So I remember I interviewed this teenage monk, and there's this kid, I think he was Laotian, and he was, and the Laotians and the Cambodians had teamed up together with, like a Thai monk, because they didn't have any monks in the United States. The Khmer Rouge had tried to, targeted and killed the Cambodian monks. So it was very hard to find someone who had survived and made it to the United States, might still be in a refugee camp somewhere. So all these different groups were teaming up together, and they were building a temple in a suburb of Des Moines, Iowa. And this kid was telling me, oh yeah, it's really, it's so terrible. I can't touch any girls all summer long. And all the monks do is just make me do all this work. And I found that was like, to me, that was very exciting and interesting. And then there were other like stories of gangs. I did a lot of stories on gangs, unfortunately. I mean, not that it was unfortunate for my training as a writer, it's unfortunate that there were gangs that were preying on their own communities and very, very violent. I did that when I was in Denver. And I have to say that I never really thought about writing creatively until I got really frustrated with journalism.
Yeah.
And I think it was the gang story that really finally broke me, because I found I've been covering these gangs that were coming up from Texas, and they were preying upon, again, Southeast Asian businesses in Denver. There was like one strip mall. There was not a large community this was in the 90s. But they were asking for protection money from like every single business. And so, community activists were saying, like, this is a real problem we have to deal with. This is hurting our ability to survive, just to make a living. And then there was nothing in any of the newspapers. I went through what was called the morgue. Newspapers all had like clipping files back then. It wasn't digitized. And you literally would have to put in a request, and you would get like this vacuum tube that would come down with a clipping in it. And I was looking, there was nothing on these gangs. And so I did break the first story, but it took so much work, and the newspapers didn't choose to publish it until after this great act of violence that led to a man he was visiting a Buddhist temple, and when the gang struck, and he ended up being shot, and he ended up having to have his leg amputated. And I felt very frustrated, because I've been working on this story for months, and I had put it out on the wire in advance of the Lunar New Year festivities to try to warn people. And I'd been working with like the one retired detective in the Denver Police Department who was assigned to the Asian gang unit, like they just didn't cover it because Asians don't have gangs. And it's like, I mean, the community's like, help, help. And so I really wanted to get this story out. Went out, no one cared because again, the model minority stereotype, Asians don't have gangs, it wasn't a problem. And so I couldn't get it published. And then until after, like, oh my God, there was this huge, horrible, violent shootout in the temple. There was a police chase across state lines, ended up in like this fiery crash, like, where was it, Kansas, I think, as the gangs were trying to, flee with the money that they had stolen from people's New Year festivities. And I felt really defeated by that because I felt like I want to make a positive difference, right, with my journalism. I didn't want to just like do the aftermath of crime. I was hoping to prevent crime. And I found like newspapers just weren't that interested until there was that bloody aftermath. And then, like my boss at the AP was thrilled because I had several front page stories and he's like, oh, you're a cub reporter and you scooped all the old timers. And he was, I was in my early 20s, but I just thought, that was so much work. And I did not feel that I was being fed, like nurtured. My soul was not being nurtured by, covering this type of crime story and enterprising the crime stories, as they say. So that was one like that led me to go back to grad school. And I thought, well, I'll do academic writing. I'll be a historian. And so I actually went to Yale and to study history. And I just still didn't dare to do the creative writing because again, like I just didn't see it. Like you can read a history book, it exists, right? But there really wasn't a lot of Asian American fiction. And it finally was that I had a tumor growing and I thought, and I faced like death potentially from cancer, that I decided, it turned out to be benign. But I just thought like, I could die first. I could really die first before pursuing this dream that I didn't know even how to pursue. But when faced with that life and death situation, I decided it was worth it. I'm going to pursue it. And so now I am a teacher and I see many of my students' names. Thank you all. Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Cyril. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for coming today. This is why I want to encourage you. It's not going to be I hope it is not as hard for you. You have paths now. Don't give up. You have pathways and the market is there. Publishers are finally waking up. I really feel like it's only been like the last couple years that I feel like they're kind of waking up, and it's taken a lot of effort and like things like the New York Times running that article where they did a study and showed that between like 1950 and 2018, 95% of the authors published by New York publishing house, the big 5 publishing houses, were white. That's something, those kind of statistics. It's still not as big of a share as we as a nation need. But I think we're on a tipping point. We can push that.
Absolutely. And I can hear, it's so interesting to hear you talk about, I had a thrill when you were talking about the stories that you were working on during your journalism, throughout your journalism career, because I feel like you're still puzzling, but now about the motivations, like you've gone backwards instead of dealing with the aftermath. I can see in the stories the way that you're exploring the roots of those events, and that's beautiful to see. We have some great questions in the Q&A. Should we
Sure.
one of these? Okay, so I'm just going to go in order. What books or stories inspired you when you were writing this particular book?
Oh, good question, Bonnie. Everything that I'm teaching it because it inspires me. So we looked at a number of short story collections, like What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky, Leslie Arama, Neka Arama. I love that collection. I loved it because, one, it's fantastic writing, and like the characters are just so real on the page. I don't know if you've read it yet, Hannah. It's set in United States as well as in parts of Africa, and it deals with diaspora, and also very anti-misogynistic, right? It deals with the kind of coming of age stories often of young girls or women who are dealing with, basically just misogyny in society. And also there's stories that are realist, and then there's stories that are speculative. I like that they could be all together in one collection. And so, as you know, in Tomorrow in Shanghai, I have realist stories, and then I also have stories that have speculative elements. And the final story is set on Mars. So I thought, yes, she gave me permission to do that. So that's one story I like to really praise. And then originally, C. Pam Jong, I felt like her novel, How Much of These Hills is Gold, inspired me as well. That's why I had, wanted to do this event with her before she fell ill. But thank you, Pam, for, originally agreeing and, supporting this. Because I felt like she wrote against historical erasure. For those who've been in my classes, for everyone else, it's like she wrote a novel set in kind of like it's like the mid 19th century, kind of from the gold rush, like just as the Chinese workers are coming in to build the railroad. So it's like really, really early. And it was specifically, she said that she wanted to write a Chinese family in America at that era, because she didn't see a lot of history about it, right? We know that they were there, but they just didn't make it into the history books,
Or into
like
the
the personal
photographs.
stories. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a great question from Lisa. I've seen some criticism from Chinese international scholars calling work from Chinese diasporic writers as inauthentic in regards to portrayals or translations of Chinese culture or Chinglish, as in ventricle.
Ventriloquizing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's late here. Chinese experiences for English-speaking read white audience. Do you think there is ever a valid argument when it comes to whose writing is more authentic when you're a writer from within the cultural community? That's such a deeply intelligent and useful question.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa Lee Herrick, thank you. That's a great question. I'm going to always say, no, I don't think it's inauthentic to write from the point of view of diaspora. That's the point of view of diaspora. I also don't think that there is one single story, as Hannah said earlier, like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, the danger of a single story. And I think that a danger from a single point of view. And I feel like there are attempts to silence writers in diaspora, because sometimes these different perspectives of a well-known story can provide new insights. And sometimes those insights are disturbing, right? So I feel like there is space for all of us together. And I feel like often the publishing industry, frankly speaking, has taken this same stance, and they preferred for many, I would say many, perhaps decades, the story that, that is made for the white gaze, but about the so-called homeland, right? And not necessarily from within the diaspora. And then everything is like pitted as, well, this is the true story, and this is the authentic story. And I'm like, it's a story, and it's a version of a story, and it comes from all of our different particular points of view. And I think that sometimes it's disturbing to people to recognize that subjectivity.
Yeah, I think you do. You showcase that idea within the characters by going so many different places. There's a real incantatory quality to that feels really saving to me. That's such a good question. And I'm also seeing Cyril's comment, which is just so beautifully written. I think it deserves to be read. That is so beautiful, Professor Chai. We set out, this is in reference to the rituals that you'd read about earlier. We set out food for 13 days, irrespective of whether we follow Hinduism or Christianity. But unless the crows eat the food, the ancestors aren't at rest.
Oh, that is beautiful. That is beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cyril, for sharing that.
It's gorgeous. Yeah. Any thoughts about where you're going to go from here? Or are you just taking a breath?
I don't even want to talk about it. I mean, like I have a lot of projects that I want to work on, including, as you know, an essay collection. And working on that. I'm also, I have a novel that I want to work on. And then there's always some short stories percolating on in the background, but like I'm so exhausted. I'm acting chair of my department this semester. I'm like, oh my God, I'm so exhausted.
I don't know how
Like I had, like I had Zoom meetings all day, and I'm like, I can't even see myself right now on the screen. I'm like, everything is blurry. My eyes are destroyed. So I don't want to complain though. It's terrible. I should not complain. Think about something positive and uplifting for people. Let me think. Hannah, what are you working on? You can be the
Oh
positive,
God,
uplifting voice.
I'm also sinking at this point. We all are. I think there's solidarity in that. I'm also trying to find ways to combat erasure, historic and current, in my writing. So this has been hugely helpful to me. Actually, I'm working on an essay right now um, that deals with some of the things that we've talked about tonight, and it's incredibly illuminating to have your perspective. And I do feel, which is a real feat, these types of events and this conversation in particular it gives me an energy to go back to the work. It's like it's the jazz call and response thing. So I'm excited to hear your voice, and it makes me want to answer on the page. So I'm excited to do that.
Well, that makes me feel very happy to hear that. I don't know if I can put this in the chat. I put it in, it says hosts and panelists. So I don't know if Carr can maybe put it in for everybody. There's one of Hannah's wonderful essays from Orion magazine. Hannah is a really interesting environmental writer, among many other things, and she combines the lyric essay form with really incisive scientific writing about climate change, and beautiful, beautiful lyric writing as well. So Hannah is one of the writers. Someone asked me, Bonnie asked me, Hannah is one of the writers who inspires me. So.
That's enough to make my voice tremble a little. Thank you. I have just enjoyed this so much and feel incredibly deeply honored to talk with you. And thank you for letting me step into this space. These are not easy shoes to fill, and I don't even intend that, but I'm glad to be here. And I thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Hannah, for stepping in at the last minute. I know it's late, you're 3 hours ahead, and you had a busy, busy day at work today. Thank you, Green Apple Books. Thank you for Kate, who just put in a question saying she's been teaching one of my stories in Massachusetts, the Saving Sardis story. And so, Kate, that came from, just my early both my reporting days, working with the various Southeast Asian communities that have been sent to the Midwest, and then basically kind of almost abandoned, frankly speaking, there. And just like, oh, see if you can survive. The economy's bad, and so is the weather. And then also my own personal experiences with a Cambodian family who'd moved to our town in South Dakota, and then got horribly attacked. It was just so haunting to me that I felt like I needed to tell that story in a longer form.
I'm glad you did. Oh, I feel the same way, Bonnie. Yeah.
Hi, you two. Thank you so kindly for joining us this hour. I so appreciate you sharing your time and talent, both of you. Hannah, thank you so much for stepping in and being so enthusiastic and engaging. And Maylee, thank you so much for joining us here and writing this book that we all get to share in now and celebrate.
Just one last shout out to Green Apple Books on the Park, as well as the Green Apple on Clement Street. They were going to have, Clement Street has signed copies, and tomorrow, as of tomorrow, Books on the Park will have signed copies. So if you want a signed copy, get it from Green Apple.
Ventriloquizing. I can't believe that I can't believe that. That was like the weirdest and scariest moment. This was a wonderful night. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you next time.